In a modern city, where order and police hierarchy reign supreme, young Officer Paul Mercier perfectly embodies the abuse of power that a uniform can grant. At just 25 years old, he has already adopted the attitude of those who believe they are above the law, hiding his inexperience behind a facade of arrogance. Impulsive and provocative, he walks the streets with an exaggerated confidence, as if his badge were an impenetrable armor, a shield against criticism, and a pass that allows him to easily cross the boundaries of ethics and morality. Paul, nurtured by a system that favors blind obedience at the expense of empathy and discernment, feels invincible. Convinced that his actions, even the most questionable, will go unpunished, he delights in a posture of absolute authority. He doesn't hesitate to interpret the law as it suits him, being inflexible with citizens he deems inferior, often based on arbitrary or prejudiced criteria. Each interaction becomes for him an opportunity to remind others that he holds the power, sometimes in a blatant manner, often at the expense of the fundamental principles of justice and respect. In his mind, intimidating is better than explaining, and forcing silence is faster than building dialogue. His youth and lack of maturity only intensify this behavior, pushing him to confuse respect with fear, authority with domination. In Paul, the power of the uniform dangerously mixes with a personality in search of validation, creating an explosive cocktail of arrogance and emotional fragility. One day, at a road checkpoint, Paul Mercier decides to stop a car that catches his attention. It displays a plate reserved for high-ranking officials, a detail that immediately raises suspicions in his mind. Inside, he finds a black woman at the wheel, dressed simply but with undeniable presence. This doesn't stop him from judging her with a look of contempt. The driver, Captain Amélie Ducour, is not an ordinary woman. A high-ranking officer in the forces, she is returning from a confidential meeting related to a large-scale national investigation. Although she is in civilian clothes for reasons of discretion, every detail in her demeanor reflects the confidence and authority earned over her years of service. However, for Mercier, her skin color and her position behind the wheel of an official vehicle are enough to arouse suspicion tinged with prejudice. In a condescending and barely concealed tone, he addresses her, ignoring the signs of her professional stature. "These plates are reserved for important people. Explain to me why you're driving this vehicle," he says, in a tone that betrays more defiance than the professional rigor he claims to embody. Amélie, unfazed, meets his gaze with controlled coldness. With a measured gesture, she takes an official badge from her bag, displaying her name and title. Captain Amélie Ducour. National investigation, she announces in a firm but calm voice, extending the identification toward Mercier. But instead of backing down, Mercier, true to his impulsiveness, persists in his interrogation, seemingly looking for a pretext to justify his behavior. "A badge can be forged," he retorts, crossing his arms with barely contained arrogance. "What proves to me that you are who you say you are?" Amélie, sensing the humiliation looming, remains stoic. Behind her calm eyes, a storm brews. But Mercier, blinded by his arrogance and prejudice, categorically refuses to verify the identities Amélie Ducour presents. He dismisses her badge with an irritated gesture, as if it had no value. Determined to assert his authority at all costs, he verbally attacks her, raising his voice to better impose his supposed power. His words become increasingly aggressive, and he subtly shifts toward racist insinuations. "Funny, people like you always find an excuse to explain shady things," he says with a mocking smile. "This car doesn't belong to you, admit it. We all know this kind of plate isn't meant for, well, you know." Amélie's blood boils, but she remains impassive, accustomed to such provocations. Yet, every word from Mercier is a sharp blade, attacking her not only as an individual but also as a black woman in a position he finds inconceivable for her. Taking an even more authoritative stance, he slams his hand on the car's roof, as if to reinforce his grip on the situation. "Get out of the vehicle immediately," he orders in a harsh tone, as though speaking to a criminal. Seeing her lack of reaction, he adds, almost shouting, "That's an order." or I'll take you in for insubordination and obstruction." Amelie, still calm on the surface, discreetly clenches her fists to contain her anger. She knows that any impulsive reaction could be used against her, and she refuses to give him that satisfaction. "Officer Mercier," she begins in a calm but firm voice, "you are overstepping the limits of your duty. I ask you one last time to verify my identity and allow me to pass, or I will be forced to report this incident officially." But Mercier, deaf to all reason, sneers, his arrogance reaching new heights. "Oh, you want to report me? To whom? Believe me, madam, you have no idea who you're dealing with. Here, I'm the one who decides, not you." What he doesn't know is that Amelie, an expert in crisis management, has already taken action. With a few discreet moves, she sent an urgent message to her husband, Marc Lemoyne, the director of the National Police, a man respected and feared in all power circles. The content of her message, concise yet explicit, leaves no room for ambiguity. Incident at the checkpoint. Hostile officer. Immediate intervention required. Her experience has taught her that in tense situations, the key lies in anticipation and the methodical gathering of information. Aware that the system protecting officers like Mercier can also, in the hands of skilled individuals, hold them accountable, Amelie remains calm. She knows that every passing minute brings Mark and his colleagues closer, and they will soon shift this power dynamic. While Mercier, swollen with pride, continues his monologue full of threats, adding arrogance upon arrogance, she remains unfazed. Her eyes, however, analyze every detail, his tone of voice, the nervous twitches in his gestures, the words he chooses and those he omits. She notes how he abuses his authority, addressing her with condescension and contempt. But beneath her apparent serenity, Amelie is already formulating a strategy. In an office not far away, Mark, in impeccable uniform, receives the message on his secure phone. In an instant, his usually serene face hardens. "Prepare a team," he orders firmly to his deputy. On his way, he quickly dials a number. "I want a full report on Officer Mercier within the next 5 minutes. All complaints, all misconduct, everything." Mark is not just a man of power. He is a man of action, and the thought that someone dared to challenge Amelie ignites a cold, relentless fury within him. A few minutes later, an unmarked car arrives discreetly at the scene, gliding into the shadows with calculated precision. Its arrival goes unnoticed by Mercier, too absorbed in his self-appointed role of uncontested authority. Barely has the vehicle stopped when a second car, with tinted windows, parks right behind. The doors open in near ceremonial silence. 2 men in dark suits step out, their confident stride and serious expressions leaving little doubt about their status. Their presence radiates power and control. Then comes a third man. He steps out slowly, as if savoring every second of the moment to come. In immaculate uniform, the shiny decorations on his chest catching the light, he embodies supreme authority. His stern face and regal posture add to the impression of power he exudes. Marc Lemoyne is here in person. His gaze, cold and piercing, cuts through the space like a blade, carrying with it silent but unstoppable anger. The silence that accompanies his appearance is almost suffocating. A palpable wave of tension spreads, reaching every person present. Amelie, still seated, straightens slightly, her face remaining calm and serene. But in her eyes, a subtle satisfaction shines. She knows the situation is about to turn, and this time, it will be in her favor. Mercier, until now unaware of the significance of what he has just provoked, finally turns upon hearing the heavy, determined footsteps drawing near. When he sees Marc Lemoyne surrounded by his men, his face freezes, then slowly crumbles. He clumsily tries to straighten up, adopting a posture of authority, but his confidence falters under the intensity of the senior officer's gaze. "Officer Mercier," Marc Lemoyne begins in a chilling voice, each word cutting the silence like a guillotine. "Can you explain what is happening here?" The weight of these few words is enough to crush any attempt at justification. Mercier opens his mouth to speak, but only incoherent stammering escapes. The arrogant confidence that had possessed him moments before collapses like a house of cards under Lemoyne's piercing stare. Amelie, seeing the ideal opportunity, calmly exits the car, her measured movements contrasting with the growing agitation around her. Her impeccable attire and graceful bearing only add to the sense of authority she emanates. In her hand, she holds her badge, which she raises with quiet confidence, like irrefutable proof of her identity and rank. Taking a few steps forward, she addresses her husband directly. Her voice is firm, composed, but laced with a controlled courtesy that amplifies the impact of her words. Mark, this officer not only refused to verify my identity, but he also threatened to take me to the station. He made comments that I would describe at the very least as discriminatory. She pronounces these words with chilling precision, each syllable ringing out like a hammer blow in the heavy silence that has settled. The already tense atmosphere seems to freeze even further. Mark Lemoyne slowly turns his head toward Mercier, his eyes hard as steel. His imposing posture and controlled silence are enough to raise the pressure. Mercier, on the other hand, grows paler, as if the weight of the situation has suddenly come crashing down on him. His shoulders subtly slump, his gaze searching hopelessly for an escape in the closed, suffocating environment of the checkpoint. The seconds stretch on, each one increasing the discomfort of the officer. Finally, Mark Lemoyne breaks the silence with a cold, sharp voice. "Officer Mercier," he begins, weighing each word, "you will immediately justify your actions. And believe me, every word you speak will be carefully recorded." His tone leaves no room for discussion. He doesn't raise his voice, but the authority emanating from him is overwhelming. Mercier tries to stammer a response, but his words get lost in a mix of confusion and fear. He mumbles awkward apologies, trying to justify his behavior, but nothing he says seems to lessen the gravity of the situation. Amelie, still standing tall and dignified, watches the scene with quiet satisfaction. She doesn't need to say another word. Her trust in Mark is absolute, and she knows this matter will be handled with the rigor it deserves. But beyond the personal satisfaction, she is determined that this incident will serve as a lesson, not just for Mercier, but for anyone who thinks they can abuse their position without facing consequences. Mark, never taking his eyes off Mercier, signals to one of the men in dark suits. The man approaches, a notebook in hand, ready to record every detail. "Mr. Mercier, your behavior today is unacceptable. You will be relieved of your duties pending a full investigation. And believe me, this investigation will be thorough," Mark adds with unrelenting coldness. Mercier, now ashen, lowers his eyes, unable to meet the piercing gaze of his superior. The room is immersed in a heavy silence, broken only by the creak of his chair as he awkwardly attempts to sit down, as if doing so might make him less visible. Amelie, for her part, slightly turns away, leaving Mark to close the scene. Her movements are subtle but laden with meaning, as though she is quietly stepping aside, knowing her role has already been played with relentless efficiency. She watches Mark with a sharp gaze, almost a silent wink at the justice she has set in motion. In her mind, one certainty dominates. This is not just a personal victory, it is a much broader message. This is not merely the triumph of an individual confrontation, but an unshakable reminder that in a world where some believe themselves untouchable, justice knows no boundaries and no one, regardless of their position, can escape responsibility for their actions. She knows that at this very moment, it is not just Mercier who is facing the rigor of authority. An entire system is being realigned, a balance restored in the shadows of decisions that are not always seen but which shape the invisible truths. She thinks of others, those like Mercier, who abuse their power, who think they can hide behind badges, uniforms, or privileges. She knows that today, it's not just Officer Mercier who must answer, but an entire blind structure that must realize that no act of discrimination or abuse of power will ever go unanswered. She looks at Mark, and in that exchanged glance, there is more than just trust in her husband. There is the recognition of a man who embodies the justice she defends. There is a silent exchange between them, like an unspoken pact they have shared for years. No matter the obstacles, prejudices, or injustices that arise, they will always face the truth. This is not a personal or political victory. It is one step closer to a world where fairness and respect for individuals, no matter their status or identity, take precedence over arrogance and discrimination. In this moment of power, Amelie seeks neither glory nor recognition. She knows that what matters is in the subtleties of action, in those silent moments when truths burst forth, forever altering the course of events. But this certainty stays with her. This is not just a message to Mercier. It is a message for all those who believe they are protected by their position, by their status. No one is above the law. And today, that lesson has been delivered with a calm but unwavering authority.